All right, so now I want to talk about some of the ways our brain uses like top-down information and some of the more cognitive aspects of how we interpret or make sense of or comprehend words, and then we'll talk about sentences from there and then get into some other language stuff. So starting with that problem we talked about earlier of speech segmentation, how the brain makes sense of this continuous input to our ears, the fact that it doesn't have, we saw before, it doesn't have clear boundaries between the phonemes, but also it doesn't have clear boundaries between where one word ends and another stops. So how is it that the brain is able to identify words that we've heard before and recognize this is a word in my language or this isn't? This is the beginning of one word, this is another. How do we pick that stuff up as babies? That's kind of what we'll talk about to start with here. So let's talk about some top-down influences on comprehending words first. There's a famous landmark study by Miller and Izard back in the 60s that showed that we actually perceive words better when they're in a normal and meaningful, like a grammatically valid sentence. So what they had in this study, what they had participants do is something we've met before in Cherry's dichotic listening task, the task that Cherry did to study the cocktail party phenomenon. We ran into this idea of a shadowing task previously, where you have participants listening to something in earphones, and their task is just to repeat out loud what they're hearing. So in this study, they had participants doing this shadowing, where they're just repeating what they hear in earphones. In one condition, they had kind of clear. It was pretty clear to hear, not too hard to hear what was in the earphones. And in a second condition, as we'll see, what they did is they added a bunch of noise. Basically, they made things a little harder, a harder task, and more ambiguity with those extra sounds. And all they were looking for is how accurate the people were in repeating the sentences that they were hearing on the earphones. So it seems like a very simple task. Now, what they did is they had participants listen to either sentences that had a normal grammar, so grammatically valid sentences like gadgets simplify work around the house, or sentences that are grammatically valid but are weird and don't really make sense. So they're grammatically valid but may not have an underlying meaning to them that we can make sense of. So like gadgets kill passengers from the eyes. That's grammatically valid, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, or if it does, it's not something we would hear very often. So weird but grammatical sentences. And then they had a third set of sentences, which was not real sentences, but actually just strings of words, the same kind of words that might show up in those other sentences, but ungrammatically put together. So put together in a way that doesn't follow the rules of English. And they had people listen to a bunch of different sentences of one of these three types and just, again, shadow it. So they just had to repeat out loud what they were hearing in the earphones. What they got was about 90% accuracy in the normal grammar condition, around 80% when it was grammatical sentences, but kind of a little weird and unusual. But accuracy dropped a fair amount when people had heard strings of words, were hearing strings of words that didn't make a lot of sense. Now, the interesting part is that second condition I talked about, where they had people do this task, but with some distracting noises in the background, basically where it's a little harder to hear the thing you're trying to hear. So in that condition, watch how their accuracy goes down in these three conditions. So here it's about 90, about 80, and about 55. And when there's background noise added, what we find is the participant's accuracy does go down. In the normal grammar condition, they're down from 90 to about 60%. But the real drop is for those sentences that aren't as grammatical, and especially the ones that are totally ungrammatical sentences. What we find is people just can't even hear those words. Like the perception of those individual words becomes harder when they're not in grammatical order. That's a little weird when you think about it, because what comes into our ears is the same, right? The gadgets and the gadgets. When you hear the word gadgets either way, you're like the same thing is getting into your ears. In both cases, it was the same amount of background noise over the same set of phonemes, the same sounds, the same auditory profile getting into the ear, and yet people's ability to hear the same thing under the same circumstances differs depending on whether the words that were around it are grammatical or not. So that shows that our ability to even perceive what we're hearing, to hear one word versus another, to be able to accurately hear that word, depends a lot on the context that comes from those surrounding words and whether they're within a given grammatical structure, right? That might help us disambiguate, right? If it's a normal grammar with a meaning that makes sense, then it helps us disambiguate where the brain might have gotten kind of a fuzzy, I'm not sure, maybe it's the word gadgets, maybe it was the word badgers, maybe it was the word, right? Different words we're not sure of, but with the rest of the info in that sentence, it becomes easier for the brain to disambiguate. So this is an example of a top-down influence. We're using our knowledge of language, knowledge of the other words, the context of what we just heard or hear shortly after in order to actually perceive the incoming sound, to organize it in a way that makes sense and say, oh yeah, it's this word, not some other word. This is why if you're listening to a foreign language, for example, especially one that uses different speech sounds than your native language or languages that you speak, when you're listening to a foreign language, it often sounds like an unbroken string. And that's the case for people listening to English who don't speak English. And it's the same for people listening to Mandarin who don't speak Mandarin and so on. It sounds like an unbroken string, literally because if you haven't heard that language before, you don't speak that language, your brain isn't able to organize that continuous speech signal, that auditory information that's on a continuum. It's not able to organize it and do the work of breaking it up into discrete, meaningful components. And that's why when someone who speaks that language, they will clearly hear distinct, separate words there. But someone who doesn't speak that language is just going to hear others speaking it and be like, wow, they're just kind of just going on in an unbroken string of sounds. That's why we have that experience sometimes when listening to people speak a language we're not familiar with. So the fact that we perceive distinct words, what it's really proving is that our perception is not based solely on the energy hitting our receptors, right? The cochlea inside of our ear. In other words, our perception is not just bottom up based on the incoming sensory information. So to give you another example, this is kind of like what we've seen throughout the semester where top-down knowledge matters. Here's an example where top-down knowledge will help us recognize where one word ends and another begins, and kind of a fun demo. What I want you to do is just read these, just silently read these words here. And I might ask you, now that you've read those words, what do they mean? And maybe you spotted this, but most people, the first time they read this, don't get anything out of this. It seems like a kind of random string of words and don't make a lot of sense together. But now I want you to take a moment to read the series of words out loud, speaking rapidly and ignoring the space between the words. So try that a couple times. So if you tried it, when you say it out loud and kind of ignore that space between the words, it runs together and sounds something like, "An American delights in simple playthings," which is a sentence that our brain can organize together from that, right? That isn't as obvious when we're seeing the spaces and kind of reading the words separately. So top-down knowledge, and a more simple kind of everyday example of this thing would be like the big girl versus big Earl tend to be pronounced the same. So like, be a big girl and eat your vegetables, or the thing Big Earl loved most was his car. The speech sounds that come out are the same, and yet our brain will interpret it very differently, one referring to a girl and one referring to a person named Earl, depending on the context, the surrounding information, the rest of the sentence. So the same sound, yet having different context, right? The meaning, the prior knowledge, things like that will change what words we actually perceive in the speech signal. So like the familiar I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream, right? I scream and the food ice cream. So screaming versus the food ice cream. Those sound the same. We pronounce them basically the same, and yet that's why the kind of rhyme is so fun for kids, is it's referring to two different things. Our brain is able to pick up the difference. Or those were jokes like, my proctologist is named Ben Dover, right? And if you pronounce it quickly, Ben Dover, yeah, proctologist. And kind of a common joke with this is, a little boy and a man are standing at a bus stop on a cold day. The boy looks at the man and asks, "Is that an icicle on your nose?" And the man replies, "No, it's not." Like, no, it's not. Or no, it's not. So anyway, these are funny things that work only verbally out loud, but the point is, like, we make sense of these things depending on the context, and these jokes work because it leaves it ambiguous, right? It works either way. That's how the joke works, but usually our brain is just doing this stuff automatically, which is why I don't hear "be a big Earl and eat your vegetables when someone's talking to their daughter at the dinner table. On top of that, though, so getting a little past just these plain, simple effects of top-down processing, we also have tried to dig into some of the mechanisms of how language learning when we're infants, like when we're little babies, first exposed to language sounds, how the brain starts to pick up on and recognize the patterns that help us identify what is a word in our language versus not. Like what are the different words in our language, given again that what these little babies are hearing when their parents are speaking to them is a continuous string of sounds that doesn't easily and obviously break up into different words. So how does the baby's brain eventually learn that there are a set of distinct words in that language and be able to tell them apart when it's all just a continuous stream of sounds constantly? So that's the kind of thing that psychologists, developmental psychologists have studied in the realm of psycholinguistics. And what we found is a lot of our spoken language learning is unconscious and it's automatic. It's just recognition of statistical patterns that the brain has done. I've talked before about the brain being this pattern recognition device, and this is a perfect example of that. So I want you to think for a second, when a parent, like a mom or a dad, is talking to a little infant, or talking about a little infant, they might say a phrase like pretty baby, like that's a pretty baby, right? And when the baby is hearing this, again, it's an unbroken string of sounds, so it's not easy to know that, for the baby, it's not easy to know that that's one word, pretty, and another word, baby, right? It's just as possible to this kid who's never heard language before that what we've got is like a word pret and a word to baby, and that those are two separate words that way, that split the continuous sound stream up into those two pieces. So how is it that our brain learns as we're little kids, and then as we keep growing and getting more familiar with language, how is it that we learn where one word ends and another begins when that information just isn't contained in the actual physical signal? Well, it turns out, just based on the statistical patterns of which sounds come before and after which other sounds, that may contain enough information on its own through those statistical patterns to help a brain pick up on where one word ends and where another begins. And I want you to think about that in terms of this example I gave of pretty baby. The most likely split here is probably between the pretty and the baby, just because statistically, if you hear enough English sentences, you hear enough English sounds all crammed together, statistically in English, the pre and the t often show up together in the same word, and yet the t and the b, the kind of end of one word and the start of another, those don't show up as often together, right? Pretty shows up before a bunch of other words, not just baby, but it could be pretty person, pretty whatever, pretty flowers, a bunch of different things. So the t doesn't always get followed by b, right? That has a sort of statistical, you could say it's statistically less common that the ty is followed by the ba sound, whereas the pre t is almost always followed by the ty or something like that. That's kind of the idea we're talking about here. So how do we know that? Well, actually, there's a landmark cognitive psychology study from a developmental psychologist, Saffran, back in the 90s, did a series of studies and into the early 2000s. Saffran and colleagues demonstrated that infants do this sort of learning of language in statistical way, just based on statistical patterns. And they proved this with a really creative, a really elegant design for their study. Basically, they invented a brand new but very simple language for some infants to listen to see how the infants learned, how quickly the infants could learn this new language. So this language, this fake language they came up with, was actually just made up of 4 words. So it's a very simple language, just 4 different words, and they were looking at how the little infant brain could piece together which of these are words. In other words, how quickly the infant brain could pick up that these are the 4 words of that language. And the words were Badaku, Padoti, Gulabu, and Tupiro. Those are the 4 words. But just like in real life, what we get when we listen to someone speak a language is an unbroken stream, a continuous stream of sounds that don't have a break between words, right? We saw that with the speech segmentation problem. So what they did is they simulated that. They created this false language, but they just streamed together 2 minutes straight of, and they had to use to make this more well-controlled in the laboratory, they even had a robot voice speaking this to make sure there was, in fact, no no stopping between one word and another, but they set it up so basically for 2 minutes straight, this robot voice was just speaking some randomized ordering of those 4 words, one after another, but in random order. So here's what that sounded like, but imagine it was for 2 minutes. This is what little infants were exposed to, and they don't even speak language yet, but just to see how well their brain can start to pick up on patterns to recognize words, they listen to 2 minutes of this.
Pabikuti budo gola tuti budo daro pi pabiku gola tuti budo pabiku gola tu daro pi pabiku daro pi pabikuti budo go.
So that, but for 2 minutes straight, that's all the exposure these little babies got. They have no idea they're even in an experiment. These are little babies. And yet just by being exposed to 2 minutes of that, what we found is they're actually able to pick up on these 4 words being distinct words. So they got this 2 minutes of those 4 words. And what I want you to notice in terms of understanding how these babies were able to break this up and recognize from that continuous stream what is words and what is not words, note there's a statistical pattern here. So within each word, like this word Bidaku, right? Within this word, the probability of each syllable following some other one is always 1.0, 100%. So the da syllable in the middle here, the da syllable in this entire language only shows up and always shows up after the bi, the b syllable. And it always, 100% of the time, shows up right before ku. So there's a pattern where you'll only hear that da sound after a b and before a ku. Likewise, the do sound in Padoti, the do sound in this whole language only shows up before the ti sound and after the pa sound. So within each word, there's a very, very clear pattern. And yet, because they randomized which words followed which other words in this 2 minute stream, what that means is between the words, as I transition from Bidaku, right, the ku at the end of Bidaku, what follows ku is not always the same thing. Right? What follows ku is sometimes pa for Padoti, but what follows ku is sometimes also go for Gulabu, and what follows ku is sometimes tu for Tupiro. So basically, what follows ku has a 33% chance of being any of those 3 other words, and what comes right before the b in Bidaku has a 33% chance of being ro or bu or ti. And so the brain can pick up on those patterns and say, what happens after ku is this kind of lower probability, a variety of different things can happen after this ku sound. That could tell the brain, this is what makes it the end of a word. And likewise, the variation of different things that can happen before the b at the start of Bidoku tells the brain this is probably the start of a word, right? Because it can come after a variety of different things. Whereas the things that always are the same within, that's probably what makes up a word. It's sort of an unbroken whole within this language. So that just, if babies can figure that out, or that's the kind of information babies could use to figure it out, that might suggest how the brain is able to do this speech segmentation problem. So were the babies able to do it? Yes, that statistical information I'm talking about, picked up in just 2 minutes of exposure to this fake made-up language, just 2 minutes was enough for these infants to pick up on the pattern. So here's the data over here on the right. What we found is basically these kids showed more surprise, so their listening time goes up. This is how we often measure what infants who are pre-linguistic, like what they notice. You can't ask them, but you can say, what do they pay attention to? And we know from habituation procedures, if you've taken developmental psychology, that little infants will spend more time on things that are novel or unexpected, things that are surprising to them. In other words, if you break the rules, they will be surprised, whereas if you follow the rules, they will not be surprised. And so what we found is they showed more surprise at new combinations where we put together parts of other words, like tibida, which is not one of the words in the language. This is a combination that never showed up together, but we put that together. There's sounds that the kid has heard, right? The individual sounds the kid has heard, but not in that order. That surprised the kids more than when you gave them one of the original whole words, like Padoti on its own or Bidaku on its own. These are perfectly familiar and unsurprising to the kids. So even though they'd never heard a pause between the words, even though we didn't give them a chance to figure out what is a word and what is not a word in this obvious way with any hint in the speech signal itself, just those statistical patterns and what sounds come after what sounds, that seems to be enough for the brain to start recognizing this is a word in my language, this is a word in what I'm hearing, and this is not a word. So that is, I think, a really clever kind of base or classic study of one of the ways in which our brain accomplishes this speech segmentation problem. A lot of it really is just pattern recognition that the brain does on its own. So really what we've got when it comes to making sense of the words that we hear, making sense of the language others are using at the level of words, what we've got is a combination of bottom-up processes and these top-down processes from our knowledge, our meaning, our past experience, including statistical regularities and things like that. But the combination of that goes in together to give us our ability to perceive and make sense of the speech of others. So this is very similar to what we found in the topic 3 stuff of the class, where it's a combination of the incoming sensory input with what our brain contributes from its past experience or the other surrounding information or what comes in from the other sensory systems at the same time. That's what constructs, sort of hallucinates, or gives our best guess of what reality is. That's what makes us experience a certain thing. It may not always be perfectly veridical with the world, but it's usually good enough, right? It usually gives us the best kind of shortcut way of making sense of the world in an easy way. Now, to give you a couple empirical effects, I guess you could say, that show this interaction of top-down and bottom-up, I just want to mention these have been studied a lot by psycholinguistics people, is a couple effects. One called the word superiority effect. We kind of talked about this earlier with Miller and Izard's work in the 60s. The word superiority effect is that it's easier for people to perceive letters when they're in a word. We're going to see an example of this in a moment. The Miller and Izard is the sentence superiority effect. We'll come back to that. But the word superiority effect, we'll do this demo. It's easier to perceive letters when they're in a word. In other words, just your ability to recognize whether what you're looking at is the letter O or the letter E or the letter R, what letter you're seeing or hearing, right? It's easier for us to perceive letters when they're within a word. That suggests that the brain actually uses top-down information. And then the sentence superiority effect, that's one that we already saw with Miller and Izard. It's when we read words, and this in this case is about reading rather than hearing, but when we read words, we actually read them faster and we recognize them faster. We have shorter reaction time. We recognize them when it's a sped up task. We have more accuracy when those words are in a sentence. And likewise, if we're looking at degraded words, or if we're listening to degraded word sounds, so that would be like that when there's a bunch of noise in the background, like we saw with Miller and Izard, we're better at identifying those words when they're in a sentence or within context and sort of a grammatically valid sentence. So that's the sentence superiority effect. We saw that one before with Miller and Izard, but let's go and do a quick demo of the word superiority effect. And I'll have you play along, even though I'd usually do this in a live class. Just do your best, try and participate on this one on your own. So here I'm going to be flashing briefly in the middle of the screen. It's going to be a split second, but I'm going to briefly flash 6 letters. So what we got here, this is just a mask. This is just a covering, right? But I'm going to flash 6 letters here briefly, and then it'll go back to all X's to serve as a mask so that you can't use the persistence of vision, so you can't use your sensory memory. If you didn't pay attention to what those are, that info won't be there anymore in your sensory system. But what I want you to do is try and as quick as you can, kind of just pay attention to the 6 letters as they flash. And then what's going to happen on each of these trials is it's going to point to one of these locations. Let's say the third location, the third letter here. And it's going to put a letter above and a letter below, asking you which of these 2 letters was the one in that slot that you just briefly saw. So they might put an A up here and an L down here, and you're just answering whether it was an A or an L that was briefly flashed in this position at the 3rd place. Another one might ask you about the 5th position or the 1st position or the 6th or whatever. So we'll do a few trials of that. So let's do the first one. I'm going to count down, and then it'll flash really quickly, and then you have to identify which letter was there. So here we go. 3, 2, 1. So it went very fast. You're probably like, what the hell, Brian? I'm not sure. But try and guess. If you just forced guess, we often do a forced choice procedure. Which letter do you think of those two letters was the one in the 5th position there when it flashed really briefly? Was it a B or an L? And now I'll go back. I'll show you the answer. It was actually an L. So that's what flashed really briefly. We're going to do a couple more trials or a few more trials of this. So let's do another one. I'll count down. 3, 2, 1. Okay, at that 3rd position, was it a K or an R? Just guess. Now again, you might get this one right just by guessing, right? There's a 50% chance, which is why what we do is we have people do a whole bunch of these trials, a whole bunch of trials throughout an experiment, and we look for whether their pattern, like how much it is above 50%. So if they're able to retain that information, if they're able to access that information, then they'll get answers at least greater than 50%, greater than guessing, greater than chance. But what we'll actually be comparing is two conditions, which is when the letter is within a random string like this one was. So this one we just tested, whether it's a K or an R, you can see it was a K there. But what we'll test is random strings of letters like this versus when it's within a word. When it's within a word, we still have the same task, which is a certain letter was there visible, like that K was there visible for just a fraction of a second, but our ability to identify whether it was a letter K or a letter R will actually be better if it's within a word. So we'll do some more examples of this, some in words, some in random strings. So let's keep doing the same thing. 3, 2, 1. And now you try and guess, was it a T or an H there? And again, you might not get all of these right, but most people are much more likely to get this one right than those first two. So it was a word, father, and people are much more accurate at recognizing it was an H in the 4th position, even though it was there just as long as the others. And even if we put an H among a scrambled set of these same letters, people have a lower accuracy in recognizing that H and also just a slower reaction time. So let's do another example. Let's do another one. So 3, 2, 1. And again, you might be stumped. It's a little harder when it's not in a word. So this one, if I go back, was an F. There's what was flashed. It was an F. So let's do another one. 3, 2, 1. And that one was a word. You may have even caught what the word was, but then you can figure out, okay, did I see an R or an S? And people are more accurate identifying it was an S there because it was within a word. Let's do another one. 3, 2, 1. That one's often harder. Was it an H or a U? What do you think? Here's the answer. It was an H. Let's do another example. 3, 2, 1. And was it a K or was it a P? The answer is it was a P. Most people get that one right. People are much more likely to get that one right than on the ones where it's not a word because it's within a word. So that's an example of, oh, whoops, there was the last one there. That's an example of the word superiority effect that I was talking about a minute ago. It's easier to perceive letters, so we're more accurate and we're faster when they're within a word. This is really frickin' weird if you think about it, because it should be that perceiving the entire word takes longer, right? It should take longer to perceive more things. And yet we're faster and it's easier and we're more accurate to perceive an individual letter, whether a letter is even there. We're better at that if we also take into account that other information, the stuff like recognizing a letter is not just this pure bottom-up visual task of feature matching. Like when we talked about feature matching theory, that alone can't explain it. This is why this is an example of top-down effects. And as I said, we saw sentence superiority effects with the Miller and Izard work that we talked about earlier. So now let's move on to the next bit of this video, which is, or the last part of this video, which is comprehension of sentences. So getting a little higher up in the level of language, from just recognizing individual sounds or recognizing individual words to comprehending and making sense of sentences that we hear. So we're going to start with this distinction I made in the last video, the distinction between syntax and semantics. I talked about these two words, so let's go a little deeper here and see what we mean by these. Syntax, you could think of kind of as kind of the same thing as grammar in a language. It's the rules by which we combine units of a particular language together. So it's the structure of sentences or the structure of phrases, how we can put things together to make a noun phrase or a verb phrase, and how you can put a noun phrase and a verb phrase together to make a sentence. So basically, syntax tells you if a particular combination of words is valid or not valid in that language, the language that you speak or the one that we're talking about. So to give you some examples to make this more clear, let's say I give you something like in number 1 here, dog, the cat, the chased. When I say that out loud, or if you meet someone in person and they're talking to you and they say dog, the cat, the chased, you're going to say, that's not a sentence. That doesn't sound like a sentence. Are you having a stroke right now? Something seems weird. Dog, the cat, the chase. Because that is invalid syntax. In English, even though those individual English words are valid, the combination of them in that order doesn't work. It doesn't make an actual sentence. What if I take the exact same English words, though, and just rearrange them? If I put them in a different order, what I get is a valid sentence. The dog chased the cat is a valid sentence. It carries meaning that is unambiguous to anyone who speaks English. They know which animal is going after which other animal. And we know that because the order those things are put in. Because likewise, I could take those same 5 words, rearrange the order, take the same words, but put the order they're combined in and get a very different outcome, right? So the dog chased the cat, or those same words mixed up, the cat chased the dog. Those have the same sets of individual pieces, and yet the ordering carries. It helps us get across a particular meaning. So again, anyone who speaks English unambiguously knows which animal is chasing which other animal, which one is the one going after the other. In this case, it's the dog. In this case, it's the cat. That comes from the ordering in the sentence. That's syntax. That's our ability to use those rules to interpret the difference between these, even though they're combinations of the same sounds, the same words. Now, one of the most famous sentences in linguistics and in psychology probably in general is this sentence right here, came up with by this guy Noam Chomsky, we'll talk about in a few minutes here. But Noam Chomsky came up with this sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, when I say that out loud, you're probably thinking, that doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't mean anything. Like, something can't be green but also colorless. And it's not really clear how an idea can be green. Ideas aren't the kind of things that have colors, nor how an idea can sleep, nor do we usually think of sleeping as something you can do furiously. But this sentence, despite it being kind of meaningless, right, not really carrying meaning, it does sound like an English sentence. It has a sound to it that tells us this is kind of a valid combination of those types of words. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Sounds like the kind of thing that is allowed in the English language. Now, if I put those same words in a different order, furiously sleep, ideas, green, colorless, that doesn't work. So both of these, sentences 1 and sentence 2, or you could say word ordering 1 and word ordering 2, both of these are meaningless. Neither of them carry meaning. But one just sounds grammatical, right? One is grammatical. If it's valid syntactically, its syntax is okay. As we'll see, its meaning isn't. That's its semantics, we'll talk about in a minute. But its syntax, the actual ordering, is okay in terms of where adjectives go, what they follow and what they don't follow, what adverbs go with verbs and how that ordering goes. Those rules are followed in 1 but not 2. Even though you've maybe never heard this set of words before, your brain can hear this brand new combination and say, yes, that is allowed in English. That is valid syntax. Whereas the second isn't. There's something wrong. It sounds wrong. It doesn't sound sentence-like, even though we've never heard those before. That's because our brain knows the rules of how things like adjectives and adverbs and nouns and verbs can get combined together. This is what makes the game of Mad Libs fun. Mad Libs, if you don't know this, are basically these like prompts. It's like a short story or a funny little story that has blanks in them for a certain part of speech. Like you have to put a noun in, or you have to put a verb in, or you have to put an adjective in certain places. And the only way that this Mad Libs works, and why it becomes so funny when you put in nouns that might be unexpected in given places, or adjectives that don't, is they still come out as full sentences. You put the right type of thing in that place. Like an adjective going here will always make a sentence that is grammatically valid. It might be funny, in other words, it might be unexpected, the kind of thing you don't normally put there, and yet it will make grammatical sense. It will be grammatically or syntactically valid because they've used syntax, the rules of syntax, to construct these blanks, to construct these Mad Libs, and that's how the game works. You have to understand syntax in order to make a game like this or play a game like this. Now, I want you to do just a quick little demonstration here. Take a moment, if you have scratch paper near you or in the margins if you're taking notes, all I want you to do, don't overthink this, don't discuss it with anyone who might be watching this video with you, I don't know. But take a moment and just quickly draw what I've written below. So this sentence right here, just draw this sentence. If you don't have something to draw with, just think about how you would draw that sentence or picture it in your head. Take a moment and just picture that what that sentence is. Okay, now usually you might still be drawing, so I'll let you kind of finish your drawing, but you probably got the part started at least. Usually when I ask people in a big class to draw this out, and I like to have people draw this out so I know that they're actually kind of dedicating themselves to a certain picture, a certain set of events, or a certain way of making sense of this set of words in the order it's in. What I often find is about half the class draws a girl who has a telescope in her hand, or who's looking through a telescope. Half the class, though, the other half of the class, often draws a boy who has a telescope. In other words, a girl without a telescope who's looking at a boy who has a telescope. That's because this is an ambiguous sentence, right? There are two different ways to interpret this sentence. It could be that the girl is looking at the boy, and what is she using? She's using the telescope. The girl looked at the boy using the telescope, with a telescope. Versus the other interpretation is the girl looking at something. What is she looking at? She's looking at the boy with the telescope. Both of those do work. Both of those are grammatically valid within English. We have to be able to interpret. Sometimes we run into these ambiguous situations. But there are ways that our brain basically tries to make sense of sentences in order to what we call parse them, in order to make sense of them, in order to look at that ordering of words and say, this is a noun phrase, this is a verb phrase, this is what the sentence is saying. So traditional models of syntax, like within linguistics, classical linguistics, traditional models to try and make sense of how syntax worked, what they used is what's called phrase structure grammar. So it's kind of hard to pronounce this, but phrase structure grammar. In other words, the structure of little individual phrases within a sentence, like noun phrases or verb phrases. And what they looked at, or how we analyze syntax, how we analyze grammar within a linguistic utterance or something we've written, is at these sort of hierarchies of phrases. So phrase structure grammar is a way of analyzing sentences like this to understand or map out those meanings that we might take from them, so that you can actually see two different ways to analyze that same ambiguous sentence, the two distinct meanings that we might get out of it. We can actually see syntactically how those two interpretations look with phrase structure grammar. So here's what I mean by that. Just in this left panel here, the A panel, what we've got is the same sentence, right? But some people are interpreting it with a noun phrase at the start, the girl, and then she's doing something. She's looking at the boy. So there's a verb phrase here. She's looking at the boy. And then how is she doing that? With the telescope. That is one way of interpreting it. In this interpretation, if we break it down like this, we see this is the interpretation where the girl has the telescope. However, other people, their brain, in an ambiguous sentence, may jump to this other totally valid mapping, totally valid phrase structure mapping for that same set of words. In this case, we have a noun phrase at the start, the girl, but then we've got her doing this verb as part of the verb phrase. She's looking at something. What is she looking at? And then you got a noun phrase at the end here, the boy with the telescope, all going together, right? So this hierarchical ordering helps us visually distinguish this way of mapping things out, helps linguists, helps psycholinguists kind of map out or make sense of the way the brain tries to organize things together. So that's phrase structure grammar. That's the traditional way, the old model, the old way of trying to analyze and make sense of the syntax function that the brain is doing all the time. So to go back to that example we saw earlier, Noam Chomsky's sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, the reason we know that's valid, to help us explain why that's syntactically valid, is it follows rules within English that are allowed. A sentence made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, right? So the noun phrase is then made up of its smaller part, the adjective with a noun, and you can add an adjective to that. And the verb phrase is made up of a verb and an adverb. That is how those work. So we know that it follows the rules of this phrase structure grammar, the basic kind of underlying way that little hierarchical organization works within English. That's how our brain knows. We assume that the brain is doing this kind of phrase structure grammar analysis behind the scenes, unconsciously. Every time it hears a sentence, it's doing this analysis, trying to parse out a sort of mapping like this for every sentence you hear. And again, it may be that we run into an ambiguous sentence where it could be parsed in two different ways, and your brain, maybe just by randomness or what you've been thinking about previously or something like that, might jump to one or the other if there are two valid ways of mapping it out. But the point is, that's what the brain's doing behind the scenes, is kind of every time you hear a sentence, or even live as you're hearing the sentence, your brain is starting to map it out into this phrase structure grammar analysis. To give you one last example of this before we move on to a sort of more modern cognitive take on how the brain does this, let's just do a mapping of what I find one of the funniest and most interesting sentences in the English language. This is actually a grammatically correct sentence in English. It has valid syntax. The sentence is buffalo, 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 buffalo. 8 buffaloes, some capitalized, some not, because there is, in fact, a city in New York called Buffalo, and these capital B's are referring to the city in New York, and then the other lowercase b buffaloes are referring to either the animal buffalo, like a bison, right, or to like the verb to buffalo something is to kind of bully or intimidate or make fun of, to kind of deceive or mess with something. So this sentence, as weird as it sounds to say this is a sentence, it doesn't seem like a sentence. If you interpret it, if you realize these 3 different meanings of buffalo, you can make a valid sentence out of it. And the only way a lot of people find to really be able to make sense of that sentence is to do this phrase structure mapping to see what we're talking about. Well, we've got the start as a noun phrase. Buffalo, buffalo. In other words, New York animals or New York bison, right? That, and then the next chunk here is New York animals deceive, or New York animals confuse or bully, or whatever that meaning of buffalo is. But you could think of it as like buffalo, buffalo, that New York buffalo, buffalo. They also buffalo animals from New York. So they also buffalo, buffalo, buffalo. I don't know if that makes sense. Sometimes you have to look at this for a while for it to make sense, but you could think of it like New York animals, that New York animals deceive New York animals. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. I just think it's one of the weirdest, funniest, grammatically valid English sentences out there. If you look up the Wikipedia entry on this sentence, because of course there is one, you'll actually find that they've proven any number of buffaloes, like 9 buffaloes in a row, 12 buffaloes in a row, 20 buffaloes in a row, all of those can be grammatically valid English sentences. So as weird as it sounds, you could say buffalo 40 times in a row, and you have just said a valid English sentence. It's a weird side case. You won't normally run into that, and most brains have trouble automatically parsing that into the phrase structure grammar to make sense of it, just because we're using the same word, so it's a little harder. But okay. Anyway, getting back to this idea of phrase structure grammar, I mentioned that's a traditional way to analyze like how we think the brain is making sense of sentences, how the brain is organizing things into this meaningful, this is what the sentence means versus this other possibility. But there's a problem with phrase structure grammar. There's a major problem here. And I'll show you that just by looking at these 4 sentences. So take a moment and just read each of these sentences in turn. Sentence 1, Susie greedily ate the crocodile. Sentence 2, the crocodile was eaten greedily by Susie. Notice in both of these top 2, the crocodile is the thing being consumed, right? Susie is the one getting some calories. Now in the bottom 2 sentences, we have the crocodile greedily ate Susie, or Susie was eaten greedily by the crocodile. In both cases here, the crocodile is getting some calories and Susie's family is going to be sad. So the meaning of these top two sentences actually is basically the same thing. We're getting the same meaning across. The same events or proposition about the world is getting moved from one brain to another. And down here, we've got the same meaning between these two. And yet, how does our brain get meaning out of sentences like this when really, if we look at it from purely just a phrase structure grammar analysis, it's actually sentences 1 and 3 that are the most similar. So they've got the same basic words in them, the same nouns, the same pieces, right? Greedily, Susie, a crocodile, ate, same pieces. And yet, the fact that they've got the same basic structure, like a noun at the start, and then the verb phrase of greedily eating some other noun, that and being the same pieces, like they're superficially the same at the phrase structure level, but we know that is not the same meaning. So something else must be telling us about the meaning there that's beyond just this phrase structure analysis of where the noun phrases come, where the verb phrases come. Because look over here at sentence 2 and 4. Once again, what we've got is a really similar structure. If you just look at the phrase structure here, you got a noun phrase at the start, then you've got this verb and this adverb, and then this noun phrase at the end. Like by Susie or by the crocodile, right? So the pattern of these sentences, something was eaten by something, something was eaten by something, they look the same, they have the same parts, and yet our brain doesn't see these. Despite the phrase structure grammar being the same, our brain can very easily tell the difference, that these have very different meanings here. So the question then becomes, the question that was actually raised by Noam Chomsky, the guy I referred to before, the question becomes, how does our brain so easily understand those interrelationships between different phrase structure variants of the same underlying meaning or the same underlying proposition about the world? In other words, how does our brain so easily translate between this structure, X greedily ate Y, and this structure, Y was eaten greedily by X? How does our brain convert from one of those to another in a way that helps us understand, oh, those have the same meaning, those are getting the same proposition across, despite the fact the phrase structure is different? So, as I said, Noam Chomsky, a really famous linguist, he expanded that traditional analysis of linguistics to bring in a more cognitive component. He's the one that really bridged psychology and linguistics back in the 50s. And he started asking us to analyze syntax in a way that isn't just about the superficial phrase structure, that hierarchical outline, that hierarchical kind of layering of language pieces. That's not enough to explain what the brain is doing when it makes sense of a sentence, when it makes sense of language. So he expanded that earlier take on grammar to what he called his transformational grammar, a grammar of how the brain transforms from one superficial look, one superficial variant of a sentence to a different form, a way that it might look superficially different, but still carry the same underlying deeper meaning. So his grammar, his transformational grammar, was basically a theory for explaining how the underlying meaning, the proposition or claim about the world, can be expressed in very different surface ways by rearranging those phrase structures around in a rule-based way. In other words, transforming from one surface phrase structure to some other surface phrase structure in a way that maintains the same underlying deeper meaning. So basically, his transformational grammar was him outlining a set of rules for translating between different formulations of the same meaning. This guy, Noam Chomsky, he is basically, maybe not single-handedly, but he's one of the people who really killed traditional behaviorism that had otherwise been dominant up until about the 1950s. For a few decades, behaviorists had kind of ruled psychology throughout the United States and much of the English-speaking world, and he was one of the main people to cut down Skinner's work or show at least its limitations, because Skinner had tried to explain language, had tried to explain how we're able to do language behavior purely from a sort of operant conditioning perspective. In other words, things that I've heard before, when I use the sounds that match what other people make, I get rewarded, and if I pronounce things wrong or put things together in the wrong combination, kind of invalid syntax. Then I get punished, right? My parents don't give me the reward. They don't say good job or whatever it is, or maybe just people can't make sense of it, so they don't react right. And so through those rewards and punishments, Skinner thought that was enough to explain how our brain learns to do language. What is a word? What's not a word? What constructions are valid and what aren't? In other words, how we pick up syntax, all of those things. And Chomsky really, his initial work, a lot of his most famous work was just undermining that, arguing against Skinner, showing how that doesn't account for, that has trouble accounting for all the things we can do with language. And of course, one of the things that undercut Skinner was just like coming up with brand new generative sentences. I talked about generativity or productivity in that first video as a property of language. Coming up with a language someone's never heard before, it becomes a little harder for Skinner to say than how we understand that language through past experience and past rewards and punishments about that phrase if we've never heard that phrase or heard that sentence before. So that was one of the nails in Skinner's coffin for his explanation of language. And while I don't think it fully rules out Skinner's interpretation of language, I think they actually can kind of work together decently. Chomsky was really, these analyses were really what started killing behaviorism back in the 50s. Okay, so transformational grammar, this was his other kind of nail in the coffin, showing how we have this system that allows us to make sense of things. He had this more cognitive explanation of language that undermined the behaviorist explanation. So let's talk a little more about this transformational grammar idea. The Susie greedily ate the crocodile sentence, or the crocodile was greedily eaten by Susie. If you look at both of those, we saw right off the bat, those mean the same thing, right? So what we could say is they have a deep structural connection, a deep structural similarity that's not apparent just by looking at the surface structure. In other words, the ordering of whether Susie's at the start of the sentence or Susie's at the end of the sentence, whether it says ate or was eaten by, like those are surface elements. Those are about the surface structure, but that's not really what determines what's going on here. We can have a bunch of different surface structures or different ways of forming the sentences that give us the exact same deeper underlying meaning. So Chomsky made linguistics cognitive because he was interested in the deeper underlying meaning, how the brain makes sense of these propositions about the world, and then uses rules in order to create different structures out of that, or interpret different structures that might have that same deeper underlying meaning. So Chomsky kind of was explaining how a sequence of what he called transformational rules can generate different surface structures that we happen to see in a given spoken or written sentence in a way that helps us understand the underlying meaning, even if we could see a completely different surface structure that means the same thing, and we are able to recognize that again because our brain is behind the scenes doing these transformations automatically. So transformational grammar describes the system our brain uses to get various surface structures, the actual expressed sentences, out of the same underlying deep structure, so the meaning or proposition behind things. And if this doesn't make sense, I'm going to post sort of frequently asked questions, a little clarification about transformational grammar. You can also Google this, or there's some YouTube videos that explain it kind of decently. But here's an example of this. I just want to walk through one quick example, and then we'll finish this bit up. So the sentence might be something like, after the manager had assessed the information she received, she made a decision to promote the employees. Now, if you speak English, you can parse, you can make sense of this sentence. And of course, we could do a phrase structure grammar analysis here. We could map out this sentence where the noun phrases are and the verb phrases and show, yes, this is a grammatically valid English sentence. But what Chomsky was interested in is, what is the brain doing when the brain makes sense of this version of the sentence and likewise can make sense of an alternative version of the same sentence that's worded differently? What is the brain doing that allows it to understand that deeper underlying meaning? He found that the brain is following these rules, what he called transformational rules. So I'll just give you a quick example of those. For this sentence, step one rule might be, if I want to change this sentence to a different surface structure that still carries the same meaning, first I delete the subordinator, delete the after at the start of the sentence. So now I have to do more steps, right? This isn't a sentence anymore. The manager had assessed the information she received. She made a decision to promote the employees. That is not a sentence. But then you have to delete the subordinate clause for the subject. So the manager, right? So you get rid of the manager. Now I'm just had assessed the information she received, she made a decision to promote the employees. That's not a full sentence on its own. It doesn't work anymore, but that's because we're going through these steps, right? The third step would be participalization. So adding a participle, having assessed the information she received, she made a decision to promote the employees. And then to get it all the way back to the original thing, who is the she here? Well, the manager, right? That's what we took out before. So having assessed the information she received, the manager made a decision to promote the employees. Now, if you look at these two sentences, the original sentence up here and what we ended up with in step 4, these are two different sentences. They have two different surface structures, right? So the phrase structure grammar will look different. The little mapping, if we drew this out in that little hierarchy, the mapping would look different between after the manager had assessed the information she received, she made a decision to promote the employees, and having assessed the information she received, the manager made a decision to promote the employees. Those are different, right? But despite that, they have the same underlying deep proposition, the meaning. It's still communicated. It's still the same thing getting across. And that's because we follow these transformational rules. The transformation it can happen behind the scenes in our brain. That's what allows us to recognize that these have the same meaning. Basically, our brain is doing this all the time, unpacking these surface structures in order to get at the underlying proposition. That's the cognitive task the brain is doing to make sense of sentences. That's probably enough for this stuff there. What I'm going to do is finish this video now, and then I'll do a quick video on some language disorders, and that'll finish topic 8. That'll finish our first language or psycholinguistics topic. So I'll see you in that video on language disorders shortly.